Ruth Calloway stood on the porch with a Henry rifle laid easy across her forearms, watching 6 riders cut through her north fence as if the wire were nothing but string. She did not raise the barrel, but she made certain every man on a horse could see it clearly in the flat morning light. Dutch Marrow rode point, his hat brim low, a coil of cut wire already looped over his saddle horn like a trophy. Behind him, Silas Rourke's cattle pushed through the gap the men had opened, 40 head drifting onto Calloway grass as though the fence had never existed at all. "Mr. Rourke says your beeves have been drinking his water for a month, Mrs. Calloway," Marrow called, not bothering to dismount. "Says it's only fair his cattle drink yours for a while." Micah Tull watched from the barn door, 10 years old and already old enough to know that fairness was not the word for what he was seeing. He gripped the loft ladder with both hands and did not come down. "There's no water shortage on my side of that fence," Ruth said, and her voice did not rise, though something behind her eyes had gone very still. "Sweetwater Spring runs the same in August as it does in April, and Silas Rourke knows it better than any man in this county." Marrow smiled the way men smile when they already know how the argument will end. "Sheriff's coming out Thursday to look at the boundary," he said. "Might be the fence was never in the right place to begin with." That was when the second rider appeared, coming up the wagon road from the south at an unhurried walk, a lean man on a gorilla gelding with dust on his coat and nothing showing on his face at all. He stopped 40 yards short of the gap in the fence and simply looked, the way a man looks at a room before deciding where to stand in it. Marrow's hand drifted toward his hip, then stopped, because the stranger had not reached for anything and there was nothing yet to answer. "Help you?" Marrow asked, and the question came out smaller than he meant it to. "Looking for work," the stranger said. "Heard there might be fence needing mended somewhere along this road." New Mexico territory had been drier than any man could remember, and Larkspur Hollow had become a narrow strip of green between 2 dry seasons. Ruth's husband had died of fever 4 winters back, leaving her the ranch alone. Her nephew Micah had come to her that spring, after cholera took his parents, and in the 2 years since she had held the place together with a stubbornness neighbors called foolish. Sweetwater Spring rose cold and constant from limestone under the north pasture, the only water on 20 miles of range that had not gone to mud and cracked clay. Silas Rourke controlled every other well between Larkspur Hollow and the rail spur at Anders Crossing, and he had wanted Sweetwater for 11 months. He had offered to buy the ranch twice, been refused twice, and had stopped asking politely somewhere around the second refusal. The stranger swung down from the grulla and studied the cut fence line the way a surgeon studies a wound, running 2 fingers along the severed wire without touching the frayed ends. "Clean cut," he said quietly. "Somebody wanted this to look like an accident and didn't much care if it did." Marrow's jaw tightened. "This ain't your business, friend." "Wasn't planning on making it mine," the stranger said, straightening up, "just noticing." Ruth stepped down off the porch, rifle still low but no longer resting easy, and crossed the yard to stand between the stranger and her fence. "You said you were looking for work," she said. "I don't recall saying I had any to offer a man who shows up in the middle of a land dispute." "Didn't plan the timing," he said. "Name's Cobb. I mend fence, shoe horses, and I don't ask questions that aren't mine to ask." Marrow spat into the dirt and gathered his reins. "Sheriff's out here Thursday," he said again, louder this time, as if repetition might make the claim more true. "Have your cattle moved off Rourke land by then, Mrs. Calloway, or he'll move them for you." The 6 riders wheeled and rode back through the gap they had cut, driving Rourke's cattle ahead of them and leaving the fence open behind like a wound that would not close on its own. Ruth watched them go until the dust settled, and only then did she lower the rifle all the way. "I don't have money for hired help," she told Cobb, not turning around. "I have a fence that needs mending, a boy who needs feeding, and 11 months of a man trying to starve me off land my husband cleared with his own hands." "Didn't ask about money," Cobb said. "Asked about fence." Cobb worked the fence line until well past dark, and Micah watched him from the hayloft window, the way a boy watches anything new that arrives in a place where nothing new ever arrives. He noticed that the stranger drove each post with 3 strikes and never 4, and that he stopped twice to look at the tree line to the north, though nothing in the tree line had moved. After supper, Cobb went out to the corral where Ruth's gray mare had been favoring her left foreleg for a week, and he ran his hands down the leg in the dark without a lamp, speaking low the whole time in a voice Micah had never heard him use for people. The mare, who bit strangers on principle, stood still enough to let him find the stone bruise in her frog and work it loose with a pocket knife. "You've done that before," Ruth said from the fence rail, and it was not quite a question. Plenty of times, Cobb answered, and did not explain where, or when, or for whom, and she did not ask twice. He slept in the barn without being told to, rolling his blanket out near the ladder rather than in the empty stall Ruth had offered. And when Micah asked why, Cobb said only that a man ought to sleep where he can see the door. Micah did not understand the answer, but he understood that it mattered, the way certain grown-up sentences mattered even before a boy had the pieces to make sense of them. That night, while Cobb was out checking the horses one last time, Micah climbed into the loft to hide from a chore he did not want to do, and his hand found something hard and cold wedged in the lining of a saddlebag someone had left hanging on a nail. It was a tin star, tarnished dark, with letters scratched across the face that a 10-year-old could read but not yet understand the weight of. T. V. Ain, Territorial Marshal, the star said, and Micah turned it over twice in the lamplight before he heard boots on the ladder and shoved it under a loose floorboard without thinking. The way children hide anything that feels like it belongs to a world too large for them. He did not tell his aunt, and he did not tell Cobb, and he only lay awake a long time listening to the barn settle, wondering why a fence mender would carry a dead man's badge sewn into a saddlebag lining. 3 days passed in the ordinary rhythm of ranch work, and Cobb proved himself useful in ways that had nothing to do with guns. He restrung the north fence twice as fast as Ruth expected, patched the barn roof before the next rain could find the gap, and taught Micah how to read a horse's ears before the horse decided to tell you something the hard way. On the fourth night, Dutch Merrow rode out alone, no cattle behind him this time, and sat his horse at the edge of the yard without dismounting. "Rourke wants to talk terms," he said. "Might save everybody trouble." Ruth stood on the porch with Micah half hidden behind her skirts. "Tell Mr. Rourke I sold my last piece of trouble 2 winters back," she said, "and I don't keep more than one on hand at a time." Merrow's gaze slid past her to where Cobb stood near the corral, arms loose at his sides, watching without watching. "New man," Merrow said. "He know what he's mending fence next to?" "I know a boundary line when I see one cut," Cobb said, not moving from the corral. "That's most of what a man needs to know out here." Merrow held that look a moment longer than comfortable, the way a dog holds a stare before deciding whether to bark, and then he turned his horse without another word and rode back toward the Rourke spread. Ruth let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "He's testing you," she told Cobb once the dust had settled. "Rourke doesn't send Merrow out to talk. He sends him out to look." "I noticed," Cobb said. "He counted my horse, my rifle, and the distance to the barn door before he said a single word about terms." Ruth had not noticed any of that, and the fact that he had troubled her more than the visit itself. Obed Price, the town blacksmith, rode out on the 8th day to look at Ruth's mare, and stopped cold in the yard at the sight of Cobb working the forge fire himself, correcting his own shoe on the grulla with an economy of motion Obed had seen exactly once before in his life. He said nothing that day, only watched a moment too long before getting to work, and rode back to town with a question he was not yet ready to ask out loud. Obed Price came out to the ranch again 2 days later, this time with no excuse about the mare at all, and found Cobb alone at the forge repairing a hinge. He stood in the doorway a long moment before he spoke. "I buried a man who stood like that once," Obed said quietly. 6 years back, everybody in this county went to that funeral." Cobb's hands went still on the hinge, and for a moment the only sound in the smithy was the fire settling in the forge. "You're mistaken," he said, though his voice had lost its usual ease. "Dead men stay dead." "That's what the county figured too," Obed said, after Marshal Thomas Vane rode into Widow's Pass with 2 deputies to serve papers on a cattle outfit skimming beef off half the small ranches between here and Anders Crossing, and only his hat came back. He set down the tool he had been holding. "Sheriff at the time called it an outlaw ambush and closed the case in a week, which never sat right with me. A marshal careful enough to outlive 4 gunfights getting caught flat-footed by outlaws nobody ever named." Deputy Ezra Bramwell, who now wore the sheriff's star Rourke had all but handed him, had ridden with Vane to Widow's Pass that day and come back the only survivor besides 2 men nobody in the county had ever met again. The math had never troubled anyone enough to ask twice, because the people who might have asked had spent 6 years too busy holding onto their own land to look sideways at a dead marshal's paperwork. "You knew him," Obed said, not quite a question anymore. "Thomas Vane. You knew him well enough to stand like him?" "I knew him," Cobb said, and that much at least was not a lie. "Better than most men left alive." "It's not just water," Cobb said slowly. Pieces he had carried alone for 6 years finally finding a shape he could say out loud. The Anders Crossing rail spur needs a reliable water stop to justify the freight contract Rourke's been chasing from the territorial line. And Sweetwater's the only spring on the route that doesn't run dry by July, which makes this ranch worth more to a railroad than every other piece of land Rourke's already stolen combined. It was, Cobb thought, the same shape crime always took once you stood close enough to see it clearly. Men rarely burned down a ranch or ambushed a marshal out of simple cruelty. They did it because a ledger somewhere made the violence look like the cheaper option. Rourke's presenting the freight contract to the rail company at the end of the month, Obeid said. If Calloway's spring isn't in his name by then, the contract falls through, and 6 years of buying up this county was for nothing. He wiped his hands on his apron slowly. Which means Thursday isn't really about a fence line at all. That night, Cobb told Ruth the truth he had not spoken aloud in 6 years, sitting on the porch steps with the lamp turned low, so Micah's window stayed dark above them. He had been Thomas Vane, territorial marshal for 11 years, and on a spring morning at Widow's Pass he had ridden into an ambush that killed both his deputies and left him for dead in a dry wash 2 miles from where anyone thought to look. Deputy Ezra Bramwell had ridden away from that ambush without firing a shot, and Vane had spent 3 fevered days crawling toward water before a sheepherder found him more dead than alive. By the time he was well enough to ride again, the county had already buried an empty coffin under his name, and Silas Rourke had already begun buying wells with the confidence of a man who believed the only law that could stop him was 6 feet under sod. I could have ridden back in, Cobb said, and his voice had none of its usual stillness now. Told the territorial governor what happened, put Bramwell in front of a judge, taken my name back. He looked out at the dark tree line the way he always did, as though the answer lived out there among the shadows. I didn't trust myself not to kill him the moment I saw his face, and a marshal who kills out of vengeance instead of law isn't a marshal anymore, just a man with a badge and no reason left to wear it. So he had let Thomas Vane stay buried, and became Cobb instead, a name with no history and no debts, and for 6 years he had mended fences in towns he never stayed in long enough to learn the names of. Best I ever managed at leaving anybody behind, he said quietly. And then a boy hid my star in his barn loft, and I still don't know if I'm angry at him for finding it or grateful. Ruth sat very still, turning the shape of 6 years over in her mind, 6 years in which a decent county had lived under a corrupt sheriff because the one man who could have stopped it had chosen silence over vengeance. Micah found your badge, she said slowly. That's why you've been sleeping by the barn door, not habit, but fear that someone would find it before you decided what to do about it. Habit and fear aren't always cousins either, Cobb said, echoing her own words back to her without quite meaning to. But this time they were riding the same horse. He turned the tin star over in his memory, though it was still hidden beneath a floorboard 200 feet away, and for the first time in 6 years he let himself imagine wearing it again. If you go back to being vain, Ruth said carefully, Rourke and Bramwell both know exactly what that means. It means a fight neither one of them can walk away from without a rope or a bullet. It already means that, Cobb said. It is since the morning I rode out of that wash alive and decided not to tell anyone, and waiting 6 more years wasn't cowardice, Ruth. It was cowardice wearing a very patient hat, and I'm done letting it drive. Above them, a floorboard creaked, and both adults looked up to see Micah standing at the top of the loft ladder in his nightshirt, the tin star clutched in one small fist. He had heard enough through the thin wall to understand at last exactly what he had been hiding. I didn't know, Micah said, his voice small in the dark yard. I found it, and I didn't know what it meant, so I just put it somewhere safe. Cobb climbed the ladder halfway and stopped at eye level with the boy, taking the star gently when Micah held it out with both hands. You did exactly the right thing, he said. A thing that important needed keeping safe by somebody careful, and you were careful. Micah's chin trembled the way a boy's chin trembles when he is trying very hard not to cry in front of someone he has decided to admire. Are you going to leave now? He asked. Now that you don't have to hide it anymore. Cobb did not answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that Ruth came to stand at the bottom of the ladder, waiting with a patience that surprised her. I've left 100 towns without looking back, he finally said. I was good at it, better than any man ought to be proud of. But Thursday, the sheriff who let my deputies die is riding out here to hand this ranch to the man who bought his silence, and there's a boy in this barn who kept my name safer than I kept it myself. Cobb held the star up so it caught what little lamplight reached the loft. I don't think I'm the leaving kind anymore, Micah. I think Larkspur Hollow might be the town that finally makes it cost something. Micah threw both arms around Cobb's neck before either adult could say another word, and for a long moment nobody in the yard moved or spoke. Ruth watched from below with her hand pressed flat against her chest, as if she could hold something in place that way. "You'll need help," she said, once Micah had climbed down and Cobb had followed him to the ground. "Bramwell's bringing men Thursday, not just papers, and Rourke will want this finished before the rail company asks any questions." "I know where the old land office keeps its survey records," Ruth continued. "My husband filed our original water rights the year we married, notarized and witnessed, and if Rourke's claim contradicts a legal filing that predates his by 6 years, Bramwell won't have a legal leg left to stand a warrant on." Cobb looked at her for a long moment, something like relief crossing his face for the first time since he had ridden into her yard 11 days earlier. "You've been sitting on that paperwork the whole time," he said. "Why didn't you use it sooner?" "Because a piece of paper doesn't stop 6 armed men from riding onto your land," Ruth said simply. "It just tells you who wins after the shooting's done, and I was hoping it wouldn't come to shooting at all." "It still might not," Cobb said, "if we're standing in the right place with the right proof when Bramwell arrives. A marshal returning from the dead tends to change a man's arithmetic even before anyone reaches for a gun." Thursday arrived gray and windless, the kind of stillness that made every sound in the yard carry twice as far as it should. Ruth stood on the porch with her husband's water filing folded inside her coat, Obed Price beside her with a shotgun he had not fired in a decade, and Micah, against every argument Cobb had made, refused to be sent to the root cellar and stood instead at the barn door where he could see everything. Cobb waited by the well, in plain sight, wearing no badge yet, because a badge shown too early was a threat, and a threat too early was a mistake he did not intend to make. He had counted the ground a dozen times since dawn, the well at his back, the porch 30 feet to his left, the barn door another 20 beyond that, and the open gate through which Sheriff Ezra Bramwell would have to ride with whatever men Rourke had sent along. They came at 9, 8 riders instead of the 2 Bramwell usually brought for a boundary dispute. Silas Rourke himself among them on a black gelding that had never known a day's honest work. Dutch Marrow and Cutter flanked the sheriff, and behind them rode 5 men Cobb did not recognize, hired for the day the way a man hires extra hands for a difficult branding. "Mrs. Calloway," Bramwell called, reining up short of the well. "County's found your fence in violation of an established boundary. I'm here to see the cattle moved and the deed transferred peaceable, per Mr. Rourke's offer." "There's no offer on my table, Sheriff," Ruth said, "and no violation on my side of a line my husband surveyed and filed 6 years before Mr. Rourke ever rode into this county." She held up the folded paper without stepping closer. "Territorial Land Office, notarized, dated 1882. I'd ask you to read it before you finish that sentence." Rourke's horse shifted, and something crossed his face that was not quite worry yet, only the first cold edge of a man realizing his morning might not go as planned. "Paper's easy enough to forge," he said. "Sheriff, take the woman's filing into evidence and let's finish this." "It's not the paper that's the problem, Silas," Cobb said, stepping forward from the well for the first time, and something in his voice made every rider in the yard go still. "It's that Sheriff Bramwell already knows exactly whose survey line is correct, because he was standing 2 miles from Widow's Pass the day you needed a marshal removed to make this whole arrangement possible." Bramwell's face drained of color so fast that Cutter's horse sidestepped, sensing the change in its rider before anyone spoke a word. "That's not," Bramwell started, and could not finish it, because the man across the yard had pulled back his coat just enough to show the tin star pinned once again where it had rested for 11 years before a bullet and a lie had taken it away. "Thomas Vane," Bramwell said, the name coming out of him like something he had swallowed 6 years ago and never fully digested. "You're dead. I watched you go down at Widow's Pass." "You rode away from Widow's Pass," Cobb said. "There's a difference, and it's the only reason I'm not already reaching for something worse than words." The yard held its breath, 8 riders and a rancher and a boy in a barn doorway, all waiting to see which direction the next 10 seconds would break. Rourke, faster to recover than his sheriff, wheeled his horse toward Marrow. "Take the boy," he said quietly, low enough that only his own men were meant to hear it, and this conversation ends a lot faster. But Micah was already gone from the barn door, not fleeing but running the wrong direction entirely, straight toward Obed Price's smithy wagon parked at the fence line, where the blacksmith had left a second folded document tucked beneath the seat 2 days earlier at Cobb's quiet request. Marrow spurred after him anyway, and for 3 seconds the yard became nothing but hooves and dust, and Ruth screamed, tearing the stillness apart. Cobb's shot took the ground 6 inches ahead of Merrow's horse rather than the man himself, close enough to turn the animal hard and throw its rider into the dirt, and the sound of it broke the last of the frozen quiet in the yard like a dropped plate. 2 of Rourke's hired men went for their guns and found themselves looking down the barrel of Obed's shotgun and the business end of Ruth's own rifle, finally raised, finally certain. "Nobody else needs to reach," Cobb said, and his voice had gone flat and final in a way it had not been all morning. "Rourke, your freight contract with the rail company depends on a spring you don't own, filed to a family whose claim predates yours by 6 years, witnessed by a Marshal you and Bramwell tried to bury in a dry wash." Micah reappeared from behind the smithy wagon, breathless, holding the second document over his head the way a boy holds up a prize he does not fully understand but knows matters enormously. It was the sheepherder's sworn statement, taken by Obed 2 years earlier after a drunken confession nobody had believed worth writing down until now, describing exactly where and how he had found a half-dead Marshal in a dry wash the same week the county buried an empty coffin. Bramwell stared at the paper in the boy's hands the way a man stares at his own death sentence arriving early. "That statement's 6 years old," he said, though the fight had already gone out of his voice. "Nobody's going to believe a sheepherder over a sheriff. They'll believe a living Marshal standing in front of them holding his own star," Cobb said, "and a territorial judge who's going to want to know why the man who rode away from that ambush is still wearing a badge Rourke handed him as payment." He let that settle over the yard the way dust settles after a hard wind, slow and undeniable. "Your choice, Ezra. Ride to Santa Fe with me and tell the judge yourself, or let Rourke's men do the explaining after I bring the territorial marshal's office out here myself." For a long moment nobody moved, and the only sound in the yard was Merrow groaning in the dirt where his horse had thrown him, and Micah's ragged breathing where he stood clutching the statement against his chest. Rourke's remaining men, none of them paid enough to die over a water dispute, had already begun easing their hands away from their holsters one at a time. Rourke made his choice last, the way men like him always did, reaching for the one card he had left. "You shoot me, Vane, and you're a murderer instead of a Marshal," he said. "Same as you'd have been 6 years ago if you hadn't run." "I'm not going to shoot you, Silas," Cobb said, and something almost like disappointment crossed Rourke's face, as if he had been counting on the old fear working one more time. "I'm going to let a judge take everything you've spent 6 years building, one deed at a time, in a courtroom where Bramwell's testimony and a dead Marshal's return will matter a great deal more than a rich man's temper." Bramwell dismounted slowly, hands well away from his gun, and walked toward Cobb across ground that must have felt, to him, like the longest 30 feet in the territory. "I'll ride to Santa Fe," he said quietly. "Wasn't ever proud of Widow's Pass. Been carrying it longer than you probably think." Cutter and the 4 remaining hired men followed him out through the gate, none of them looking back at the ranch or the boy or the Marshal standing where a fence-mender had stood 11 days before. Merrow limped after them on foot, leading his spooked horse, saying nothing to anyone. Ruth lowered her rifle at last and crossed the yard to where Micah stood still clutching the sheepherder's statement, and she knelt down and held him without a word, because some mornings did not have language large enough for what had almost happened in them. Cobb watched the 2 of them for a moment before he finally let out the breath he had been holding since the riders first appeared at the gate. Sheriff Ezra Bramwell rode to Santa Fe 3 days later, alone this time, and testified before a territorial judge exactly as he had promised, trading whatever remained of his career for a lighter sentence and the first honest night's sleep he had managed in 6 years. Silas Rourke's freight contract collapsed within the month once the rail company learned Sweetwater Spring belonged, and had always belonged, to a family whose claim their own surveyors had to admit was airtight. Cobb did not put the tin star away again, and he wore it openly through the fall, riding the county on Ruth's spare horse to settle the smaller disputes Rourke had left simmering in his wake, though he made a point of returning to Larkspur Hollow before dark every evening rather than after. By the time the first snow came to Larkspur Hollow, Cobb had built himself a small cabin on the rise above Sweetwater Spring, close enough to the Calloway ranch to hear Micah calling the horses in every evening, and far enough to still call it his own place. Ruth found herself walking up that rise more evenings than the errands strictly required, and neither of them hurried to name what that meant. There is a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with speed or aim, the courage of a man who waits 6 years to be right instead of 6 minutes to be avenged, and Thomas Vane had spent that patience the way some men spend an inheritance, carefully, and only when it finally mattered. The county remembers Widow's Pass differently now, not as the place a Marshal died, but as the place he decided, eventually, to stop staying dead. Take care of yourselves out there. Until next time, keep riding.